Gary Ridgway, the Green River Killer. Gary Ridgway, known as the Green River Killer, is one of the most infamous serial killers in American history, whose actions span nearly 2 decades. Operating primarily in the Seattle area from the early 1980s to the early 2000s, Ridgway left behind a trail of terror that stunned the nation. His killings, mainly targeting vulnerable women, many of whom were sex workers or runaways, became a chilling reminder of how a seemingly ordinary man could commit unimaginable acts of violence. Born in Salt Lake City in 1949, Ridgway's early life was marked by an unsettling combination of childhood cruelty and a disturbing obsession with sex and violence. He was known to have had a difficult relationship with his mother, which likely contributed to the anger he would later project onto his victims. He was arrested and convicted of the murders of 49 women, although he confessed to killing 71, making him one of the most prolific serial killers in U.S. history. Ridgway's method was chillingly consistent. He would strangle his victims, often leaving their bodies in remote areas near the Green River in Washington, a habit that earned him his nickname. His killings were methodical, but they took years for investigators to connect. Forensic evidence was scarce, and Ridgway managed to evade detection for over 20 years, leading to widespread panic. Public fear intensified as the number of victims grew, but it wasn't until 2001, when DNA technology provided a breakthrough, that Ridgway was finally caught. During his trial, Ridgway's cold and calculated demeanor stood in stark contrast to the grief of the families he destroyed. He pleaded guilty to the murders in exchange for avoiding the death penalty, but his confession was a disturbing window into a man who had spent decades hiding in plain sight. The case not only rocked the Pacific Northwest but also led to changes in law enforcement procedures and how serial crimes are investigated. Ridgway's case became a focal point for discussions on criminal profiling, forensic advancements, and the vulnerabilities of women caught in the margins of society. In pop culture, his story has been portrayed in various documentaries, films, and books, further cementing his place in the grim annals of American criminal history. While Ridgway's capture brought some closure to the families of the victims, the chilling reality remains. The Green River Killer was a man who blended seamlessly into his community, and his story raises unsettling questions about how many other killers may lurk undetected, their true identities hidden behind the mask of normalcy. The legacy of Gary Ridgway is a grim reminder of the darkness that can hide behind even the most ordinary faces. David Berkowitz, son of Sam. David Berkowitz, also known as the Son of Sam, terrorized New York City between 1976 and 1977, leaving a dark mark on its history. Operating during a time of social unrest and high crime, his reign of terror unfolded in a city struggling with widespread fear and instability. New York, in the 1970s, was grappling with economic difficulties, rising crime rates, and a sense of disillusionment, providing the perfect backdrop for a killer who would elude capture for over a year. Berkowitz's early life was marked by abandonment and trauma. Born Richard David Falco, he was adopted by a couple in the Bronx after being rejected by his birth mother. Growing up in a troubled household, Berkowitz experienced isolation, and reports of an unstable upbringing led him to become an angry and vengeful individual. As an adult, his behavior became more erratic, culminating in a deep-seated obsession with violence. Psychologists later speculated that he harbored a narcissistic personality disorder, using his crimes to gain notoriety. He was methodical in his execution, choosing young couples and parked cars as his targets, firing from a distance with a .44 caliber bulldog revolver. The victims, mostly young women, were not just statistics, but individuals whose brutal murders shook the community. The public was paralyzed with fear, not knowing who the next victim would be. Berkowitz, however, was meticulous, leaving behind letters at the crime scenes taunting the police and the press. His choice of victims seemed random at first, but as the killings progressed, a disturbing pattern emerged. Law enforcement, facing significant challenges with limited forensic technology and resources, struggled to make headway in the investigation. The killer's erratic behavior and cryptic letters only added confusion. The media played a crucial role, sensationalizing the case and stoking public fear. As the investigation stretched on, Berkowitz's letters created more hysteria, with the public convinced that the Son of Sam was a deranged figure they could never catch. But after 13 months, the investigation took a breakthrough turn. In a shocking twist, Berkowitz was apprehended after a tip led police to his apartment. The man who had terrorized an entire city for over a year was just a regular, seemingly unremarkable man. In court, Berkowitz confessed to the murders, offering chilling details about his motives. He was convicted and sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. His story left an indelible mark on the public consciousness. Berkowitz's crimes led to heightened awareness of the psychological profiles of serial killers, as well as advancements in law enforcement techniques, though many still question the role of his mental illness in his actions. The Son of Sam case, widely covered in the media, became a subject of books, documentaries, and films, creating a pop culture phenomenon. But it also raised troubling questions about the nature of evil, mental illness, and the ability of law enforcement to protect the public. While the case is largely solved, some still wonder if Berkowitz acted alone, with lingering theories about the true scope of the killings. Berkowitz's story teaches us about the complexities of criminal behavior and the dark undercurrents that can run beneath the surface of a seemingly ordinary life. It serves as a reminder that the pursuit of justice is never simple and that the answers we seek often remain elusive, with unsettling questions still left unanswered. Pedro Alonso Lopez, the monster of the Andes. In the 1970s and 1980s, a chilling predator roamed the mountainous terrain of South America, leaving behind a trail of terror that would go unnoticed for years. Pedro Alonso Lopez, known as the Monster of the Andes, is believed to have committed the brutal murders of over 300 young girls across Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru. Operating in an era before advanced forensic technologies, Lopez's reign of terror seemed unstoppable, drawing fear from entire communities. Born in Colombia in 1948, Lopez had a troubled childhood marked by neglect and abuse. His mother, a prostitute, reportedly forced him to witness her violent relationships, and he was later abandoned to live on the streets. This early exposure to trauma may have shaped the violent tendencies that emerged in his adulthood. A series of arrests for petty crimes and violent behavior preceded the killings, hinting at his escalating brutality. His victims were often young girls, whom he would lure with promises of gifts or affection. Once in a secluded area, Lopez would strangle them and leave their bodies to be found later, typically in remote, uninhabited regions. Each crime seemed meticulously planned, with no immediate connection to the others, making his true nature elusive for a long time. The brutal method and his preference for young girls suggested a disturbing pattern, but it wasn't until years later that his horrifying history was pieced together. The investigation into Lopez's killings took years to gain traction. Law enforcement in the region was often underfunded, and forensics in the 1970s were in their infancy. The public was gripped by fear, but many cases were dismissed or ignored due to the victim's marginalized status. Eventually, Lopez's capture came unexpectedly when he was arrested for a separate crime in 1980 in Ecuador. After his confession to over 300 murders, he became infamous as one of the most prolific serial killers in history. During his trial, Lopez's demeanor shocked many. He claimed to be driven by a desire to exterminate young girls because he believed they were the root of evil in the world. His statements, along with the sheer scale of his crimes, left the public and investigators stunned. Despite his conviction, Lopez's fate took a mysterious turn when he was released from prison in 1998 after serving just 16 years, on the grounds of good behavior. His current whereabouts remain unknown, leading to the haunting possibility that the monster still roams free. Lopez's crimes have had a lasting impact on the region, drawing attention to the need for better law enforcement training and victim protection. The case continues to raise critical questions about justice, criminal rehabilitation, and the risk posed by serial killers who operate with impunity. His legacy, though buried under years of forgotten investigations and a lack of resolution, serves as a grim reminder of the darkness that can exist in the most unsuspecting of places. Jack Unterweger. Jack Unterweger, a name that still echoes through the dark corners of criminal history. Born in Austria in 1950, his early life was one of turmoil and trauma. Raised in a strict environment, Unterweger's mother was absent for most of his childhood, and his father, a violent man, was a distant figure. His formative years were marked by criminal behavior, with his first run-ins with the law at a young age. As a teenager, he was involved in petty theft, and later, in 1974, he was convicted of the brutal murder of a woman, leading to a prison sentence that would become a pivotal turning point in his life. While incarcerated, Unterweger's personality began to morph. Prison became a place of transformation, where he read extensively, developed a taste for writing, and was hailed as a rehabilitated individual. He used his newfound fame as a writer to manipulate his way out of prison early, even securing the support of prominent figures who believed he had turned over a new leaf. However, his outward charm and eloquence hid a darker side, one that would lead to a series of brutal murders. His victims, mostly prostitutes, were strangled with their own bras, a chilling pattern that linked them together. Between 1990 and 1992, Unterweger's reign of terror spanned across Europe, from Austria to the United States, leaving behind a trail of blood and confusion. The police, however, failed to connect the dots until it was too late. The investigation into Unterweger was fraught with complications. At first, law enforcement overlooked the mounting evidence, convinced that the killer was just another faceless predator. But with each new victim, the public's fear grew. The media played a crucial role in spreading panic, especially after it was revealed that the killer had been a celebrated writer, seemingly rehabilitated from his violent past. It wasn't until he was apprehended in 1992 that the full extent of his crimes came to light. His capture was a culmination of careful police work, including a breakthrough when a connection was made between his criminal past and the recent murders. At trial, the courtroom was filled with tension as Unterweger's charm once again became evident. His defense argued that he had been wrongly accused, but the evidence was irrefutable. Unterweger was convicted of 11 murders, though it's suspected that the true number of victims may be higher. His sentence, life imprisonment. But his story didn't end there. In 1994, just 3 years into his sentence, Unterweger was found dead in his cell, having allegedly committed suicide. His case left a profound impact on society, prompting a re-evaluation of the justice system's handling of rehabilitated criminals. His crimes also influenced how we view the psychology of serial killers. His case revealing that some criminals can charm their way into society's favor, only to strike again. Jack Unterweger's story raised countless questions about the nature of criminal rehabilitation and the danger of dismissing past behavior as a thing of the past. Today, his name still sends a chill down the spine, a reminder of the darkness that can lurk beneath even the most polished facades. Richard Chase, the Vampire of Sacramento. In the mid-1970s, a wave of terror swept through Sacramento, California, as a man who would later be dubbed the Vampire of Sacramento embarked on a horrific killing spree. Richard Chase, born in 1950, grew up in an environment marred by neglect and instability. Early signs of mental illness and bizarre behaviors emerged in his childhood, which were compounded by a strained relationship with his parents. Chase was subjected to abuse and was often seen as a deeply troubled individual. His disturbing behaviors escalated throughout his adolescence, and he was eventually diagnosed with schizophrenia. By the time Chase's killings began in 1977, he was living in a disheveled apartment, isolated from the world. He believed that he needed to consume human blood to survive, and his delusions led him to gruesome acts of violence. His first victim was a woman whom he brutally murdered and mutilated, drinking her blood in an act that shocked the community. Over the next month, Chase would kill 6 more individuals, including a mother and her child, in a series of increasingly savage and senseless attacks. What made Chase particularly terrifying was his modus operandi. He not only killed, but he drank the blood of his victims, often in horrific and ritualistic ways. The public reaction was one of sheer panic, as families feared that a bloodthirsty monster was on the loose. Law enforcement at first had little to go on, and the investigation seemed to go nowhere as the killings grew more violent and erratic. Chase's capture came after a thorough investigation that linked him to the murders through forensic evidence and witness testimony. Once arrested, his trial revealed the extent of his mental illness, though his defense did little to stop the inevitable verdict. In 1979, he was convicted of 6 murders and sentenced to death. However, his story did not end with his conviction. Chase's mental state remained a subject of debate, and he eventually died in prison in 1980 from an apparent suicide. The chilling nature of Richard Chase's crimes left a lasting impact on the Sacramento community and law enforcement. His case raised significant questions about the intersection of mental illness and violent crime, pushing for better understanding and treatment of psychiatric disorders. In pop culture, Chase's story became a dark example of the horrors that can be lurking within the human mind, yet also highlighted the urgent need for better mental health care. His legacy serves as a haunting reminder of the complexities of criminal behavior and the potential dangers when untreated mental illness goes unchecked. Even today, the unresolved questions surrounding Chase's life and the motivations behind his murders continue to provoke intense discussion, leaving a shadow over the history of serial killers in America. Issei Sagawa, a name that still sends a chill down the spine of those who've heard his story. His crimes, horrific beyond comprehension, not only shocked Japan but reverberated worldwide, raising unsettling questions about human nature and the complexities of justice. Born in 1949 in Japan, Sagawa's early life was marked by severe trauma. As a child, he suffered from a rare condition that left him physically weak and socially isolated. Growing up, he became obsessed with the idea of eating human flesh, a dark desire that festered over the years. His fascination with cannibalism took root during his studies in France, where he would eventually carry out his grisly act. In 1981, Sagawa lured a Dutch student, René Hartevelt, into his apartment under the pretense of wanting to write a paper about her. But his intentions were far from academic. He shot René, dismembered her, and ate parts of her body, all while rationalizing the act as a twisted fantasy fulfillment. The crime was gruesome and left a trail of physical and psychological devastation, not only for René but for her family and the broader public. Despite the brutality of the crime, Sagawa was not sentenced to prison. After his arrest, he was declared legally insane and deported back to Japan, where the shocking reality unfolded. He was never charged for his crime and instead he became a bizarre celebrity. His story was fodder for tabloid media and documentaries, feeding public morbid curiosity rather than justice. This led many to question the reliability of the legal system and the fairness of his treatment. Sagawa's case influenced the public and ignited a conversation about mental illness, criminal responsibility, and the limits of justice. His story remains a haunting reminder of how deep-seated fantasies can lead to devastating consequences, and how the public's fascination with such figures can blur the lines between justice and notoriety. Though he's been largely forgotten by some, Issei Sagawa's tale continues to inspire fear and intrigue. Was he truly insane or did he exploit the system for his own gain? To this day, the questions remain unanswered, leaving his legacy shrouded in unsettling ambiguity. Dennis Rader, the BTK killer. In the quiet suburbs of Wichita, Kansas, during the 1970s, a shadowy figure was casting terror into the lives of many. Dennis Rader, who would later become known as the BTK killer, named after his chilling modus operandi, bind, torture, kill, was not just a killer but a master of manipulation and a mind cloaked in darkness. Born in 1945, Rader's early years were marked by feelings of isolation and neglect. Raised in a seemingly average family, there were signs of his deepening psychological turmoil, a fascination with death, violence, and control. This was a man whose childhood was full of cruelty and a budding obsession with power. Rader's first known murder occurred in 1974, but it wasn't until 1977 that he fully embraced the identity of the BTK killer, terrorizing the community for over 3 decades. His crimes were brutal and calculated. In each instance, he would bind his victims, torture them, and ultimately take their lives in the most shocking ways, leaving behind chilling evidence that became his trademark. His selection of victims seemed arbitrary at first, but soon a chilling pattern emerged. They were often vulnerable women caught in their homes and subjected to an ordeal that left no room for mercy. The impact on the community was profound. Families lived in fear, never knowing who would be next. Rader's ability to evade capture added to the terror, as law enforcement struggled to put together the clues he so carefully left behind. Public fear escalated, fueled by media attention, and the police were left with only pieces of a puzzle that seemed impossible to solve. For years, Rader's identity remained hidden, as he taunted authorities with letters, bragging about his crimes and the power he held over his victims. But it wasn't until 2005, decades after his last known killing, that the case was cracked wide open. A breakthrough led to Rader's capture, and the community was forced to face the grim reality that the man they had known as a church leader, a father, and a seemingly ordinary member of society, had been hiding in plain sight. At his trial, Rader was convicted of 10 murders, and his chilling confession sent shockwaves through the nation. He was sentenced to life in prison, but his capture raised many unsettling questions. How did he manage to maintain such a facade for so long? And what drove him to commit such horrific acts? Some theories suggest a deep-seated need for control, while others point to a lack of empathy, a terrifying combination of traits that allowed Rader to live out his dark fantasies without remorse. Rader's crimes have since become a sobering reminder of the darkness that can dwell within even the most ordinary of people. His story sparked renewed discussions on the nature of evil, the psychological motivations behind serial killings, and the vulnerabilities in our own communities. In the years following his capture, Rader's case has been analyzed extensively, shedding light on how a person can hide such monstrous actions under the guise of normalcy. Today, his name remains synonymous with terror, and his legacy has influenced both criminal profiling and the study of the psychological makeup of serial killers. Rader's story continues to raise questions that may never be fully answered, questions that remind us of the potential for darkness in the most unlikely places, and the long-lasting impact of his crimes on the victims' families and society as a whole. Edmund Kemper, the co-ed killer. Edmund Kemper, known as the co-ed killer, operated during the 1970s, a time marked by increasing awareness of violent crime and the rise of serial killers in America. Society was grappling with the cultural shifts of the late 20th century, while law enforcement was beginning to recognize the emerging phenomenon of serial murder. Yet, even in this climate, Kemper's crimes went unnoticed for months, as he carefully concealed his disturbing actions. Born in 1948 in Burbank, California, Kemper's early life was marked by rejection and instability. His parents' tumultuous marriage and his mother's harsh, emotionally abusive treatment left deep scars. These early experiences seemed to mold his twisted psyche, with signs of violent tendencies surfacing during his adolescence. At just 15, he murdered his grandparents, setting the stage for what would become a string of grisly killings. His charm and intelligence hid the monster within, making him appear like an ordinary, affable young man, but beneath the surface was a deeply disturbed individual. Kemper's killings began in 1972, starting with the murders of 6 young women, all of whom were hitchhiking and traveling to Santa Cruz. He often lured his victims into his car before overpowering them, strangling them, and then performing horrific post-mortem actions. Each murder was meticulously planned, and Kemper often took trophies, personal items from the victims, as keepsakes, a chilling reminder of his control over life and death. The victims, primarily college students, were all young women with promising futures, making their deaths all the more tragic. The public was gripped by fear, and the investigation into the disappearances seemed to go nowhere, despite growing anxiety in the community. With no solid leads, authorities struggled to piece together a profile of the killer. Kemper, however, was not as careful as he thought. After killing his mother and her friend in 1973, he finally made a critical mistake. He confessed to the police. His arrest brought an end to the terror, but the impact of his crimes on the community lingered. The public's response ranged from horror to fascination as Kemper's psychological profile became the subject of intense study, offering new insights into the nature of serial killing. His trial was a spectacle, drawing media attention and sparking debates about his mental state. He was convicted and sentenced to life in prison, where he remains to this day. Kemper's legacy is one of chilling intellect and a horrifying reminder of the darkness lurking in ordinary-looking individuals. His crimes left a lasting impact on law enforcement, prompting advancements in criminal profiling and forensic techniques. While his case has been extensively covered in media, documentaries, and films, it continues to raise questions about the complexities of human behavior and the factors that contribute to such unspeakable acts. Edmund Kemper's story is a stark reminder of the potential for evil that can exist within the most seemingly innocent minds, and the lessons it teaches us about the nature of violence, justice, and the mind of a killer. Karla Homolka and Paul Bernardo, the Ken and Barbie killers. In the early 1990s, 2 seemingly ordinary Canadians, Karla Homolka and Paul Bernardo, embarked on a spree of unimaginable horror, one that would forever change the way society viewed the capacity for evil in those closest to us. Paul Bernardo, a charming, successful businessman, appeared to be the perfect husband, while Karla Homolka, a bright, attractive young woman, seemed to have the life everyone would envy. But beneath their pristine exteriors lurked a darkness that would shock the world. Karla's early life was marked by her desire for approval, but she was also raised in a strict, overbearing family. Her history showed signs of trauma, but nothing that could explain her later actions. As for Paul, he had a troubled youth, exhibiting violent tendencies early on. His aggressive nature, coupled with an obsession for control and dominance, set the stage for the horrors to come. Between 1990 and 1992, Paul and Karla's reign of terror included the brutal rapes and murders of 2 teenage girls, Kristen French and Leslie Mahaffey. The crimes were meticulously planned, with Paul taking the lead in the violence, while Karla, complicit, filmed the horrifying acts. Their method was chillingly methodical, with Karla often playing a pivotal role in luring the victims into their grasp, before Paul executed his sadistic fantasies. The investigation began in 1992, when the bodies of both Kristen and Leslie were discovered, leading to a public outcry. But the real breakthrough came when Karla's involvement was revealed. Initially, Karla maintained that she was a victim, but the tapes showing her active participation told a far different story. As law enforcement pieced the evidence together, it became clear that Karla was no innocent bystander, but an equal participant in the gruesome murders. Public reaction was swift and harsh. The media dubbed them the Ken and Barbie killers, using their youthful, attractive appearances as a stark contrast to the horrific crimes they had committed. The trial that followed was a media sensation, with Carla cutting a deal, pleading guilty to manslaughter in exchange for a reduced sentence. She served just 12 years in prison. Paul, on the other hand, was convicted of multiple murders and sentenced to life in prison. The case sparked intense discussions about the psychological dynamics of abusive relationships and the role of manipulation in criminal behavior. It also raised questions about the limits of justice, as Carla's light sentence was widely criticized. In the years following the trial, the crimes and their cultural impact lingered, raising difficult questions about human behavior and the capacity for evil. Carla's story, though often reduced to tabloid sensationalism, offers a chilling look at how a relationship, steeped in violence and control, can create a perfect storm for horrific acts. To this day, the legacy of Carla Homolka and Paul Bernardo serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked power, manipulation, and the terrifying realization that sometimes the most horrifying monsters are the ones who look the most normal. The Grim Sleeper, Lonnie David Franklin Jr. In Los Angeles from 1985 to 2007, the city was haunted by a predator who carefully hid in the shadows, leaving behind a trail of death and terror. Lonnie David Franklin Jr., known as the Grim Sleeper, managed to evade capture for more than 2 decades, his crimes going unnoticed for years. During this time, Los Angeles was experiencing significant social changes: a growing homeless population, a rise in gang activity, and a city struggling to respond to violent crimes. Franklin's early life gave no clear warning of the horrors he would eventually commit. Born in 1952, Franklin had a seemingly ordinary upbringing, but he was known for his quiet demeanor and odd behavior. He was a mechanic by trade, a father and a husband, someone who appeared to blend into the background of society. However, underneath this ordinary facade, there were deep psychological disturbances. Franklin exhibited a disturbing interest in women, often targeting vulnerable victims, mainly African American women, who were often sex workers or living on the fringes of society. The murders began in the mid-1980s, with Franklin targeting women in the South Los Angeles area. His methods were brutal yet calculated. Franklin strangled his victims, often using a rope or other cord, and his crimes were particularly chilling due to the way he left his victims. Some were discarded on the streets, while others were carefully hidden in secluded areas. The nature of the crimes led investigators to believe that they were the work of a serial killer, but without enough evidence or witnesses, the case went cold. It wasn't until a brief lull in the killings in the 1990s, followed by a resurgence in 2002, that the media began to take notice again. It seemed that Franklin had slept for years, only to return with more bloodshed. The killer's connection to the victims seemed to follow a pattern. He preyed on women who were often seen as expendable by society, leading investigators to believe that their lives were undervalued. Despite this, the case remained unsolved, and public fear grew as the media coverage intensified. But it wasn't until 2007, when DNA evidence and modern investigative techniques came into play, that the pieces of the puzzle finally began to fit together. Through a stroke of fortune, DNA from one of the victims was matched to Franklin's son, a clue that ultimately led investigators to Franklin himself. In 2010, after years of evasion, Franklin was arrested. The trial was a spectacle that gripped the public. Franklin, a man who once appeared unremarkable, was revealed to have been a calculating and cold-blooded killer. He was charged with the murders of 10 women, though investigators believe there may be many more victims. In 2016, he was convicted and sentenced to death, though he will likely spend the rest of his life in prison. The Grim Sleeper case highlighted the limitations of law enforcement at the time. Investigators lacked the advanced DNA testing methods we take for granted today, and the victims were often marginalized, which led to a delay in identifying the killer. The case also brought attention to the importance of DNA databases and the use of familial DNA in solving cold cases. Lonnie Franklin Jr.'s story is a stark reminder of the horrors that can lurk behind ordinary facades. His reign of terror lasted for over 20 years, but his capture also demonstrated the advancements in criminal justice, specifically in forensic science. While the killer was eventually brought to justice, the dark legacy of his crimes lingers, leaving many to wonder just how many lives he destroyed before he was finally stopped.